All right, I want to start with a survey I did with GPT, looking for the buzzwords around AI. So this is how I did it. I asked it, could you name a few newspaper article titles related to AI? So it thought for a while and gave us a whole list of convincing answers. These answers are not surprising. Take a second to look closely. And I've also highlighted a few important keywords over here. It reads the future of technology, a new frontier, a new paradigm, new era, etc. I think this aligns well with how most people see AI. And much of this notion is truthful, but standing here today, I'm not presenting as an AI scientist or investor. I don't buy or sell such fantasy. I'm a designer coming from a discipline with a very long history, and I like to treat these emerging technologies as commonplace tools, as something that is not different from a pen or a violin. To give a bit of self-introduction, I am an architect who dabbles in digital imaging. More precisely, I experiment with digital mediums that capture, represent, and speculate about reality. Besides generative AI, which is the most heated topic today, I also play with other mediums such as 3D scanning and other 3D visualization methods. Over the past years, these experiments oftentimes culminated as short films, sometimes through collaborations or through teaching. What I have witnessed can verify a well-known fact, which is that all of these technologies are evolving at an astonishing speed. Some of you might still remember the meme where Will Smith is trying very hard to eat spaghetti as a comparison of past and now AI methods. For copyright reasons, maybe I cannot show that, but let me illustrate this using my own examples over here. So this was done a few years ago using the method which was very popular and very advanced back then. It was one of the most advanced AI generator back in 2021. And I give it a prompt. It says an endless corridor in the film The Shining. And in fact, the result was quite pertinent because it captures some of the most iconic elements in the film, such as the red carpet or the floor tile. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be very consistent. We see frames flickering, shimmering, and there are ghostly figures that are disappearing and reappearing again. And also, it doesn't have a very good knowledge of space, nor does it understand the law of perspective. However, in the later experiment, I took one frame from the previous video, and this time I was using one of the latest AI video generator. And although the first frame still doesn't seem to be very realistic, this AI method is able to quickly adjust that and eventually generate a convincing walk down the corridor. So let's change to another medium. This time, let's look at TEDxHKU, which is to use text prompt to generate three-dimensional models. In 2022, OpenAI released Point E, which was one of the first text-to-3D models ever. Despite being a groundbreaking step, what it could do was pretty limited because the result was nothing more than a rough point cloud model with only a few colors, somehow resembling early-stage computer graphics. However, the visuals have been largely improved over the past years. For example, using a tool that came out in 2024, now the results are a lot more convincing. Users can generate high-resolution mesh models with PBR material, standing for physically based rendering material, only within minutes. And also, the result is getting a lot closer to reality. For example, the pumpkin on the right, I think it is even more tangible than some of our own evasive imagination in our minds. All right, the last example is not so much related to AI. This is 3D scanning. The picture you see right here is done through a conventional method called photogrammetry. One of the limits is that it is not very good at dealing with either capturing or representing whatever that is not matte or solid. In this case, for example, trees or water. However, this limit was also overcome by recent methods such as neural radiance fields or Gaussian splatting. Over here, you can see that the refraction, the reflection, the fuzziness of the trees, all of those were rendered fairly realistically within a certain resolution. Well, I have to say that all of these examples are done by myself, so they might not fully represent the capacity of these mediums. But I hope they at least make one thing clear, which is how fast things have changed. and this change is still ongoing. That actually brings us some challenge. For people who are outside of this realm, it might be so hard to keep track of what's going on. It's even more challenging as a designer, because imagine a designer spending a whole month trying to learn the latest tool, only to find out that a more powerful one has just come out. So toward that, a practical suggestion could be, why don't we just wait? Why don't we just wait till a more powerful, a more mature, and more advanced tool to come out? That is certainly not the point of today's talk. And I like to do the opposite. I like to experiment with these tools before they're polished. And I always try to be one of the first people to test out a tool, to understand its limits and capacities, and therefore trying to discover the potential of it. I would argue that the old version, the early version of these AI tools aren't necessarily bad. They're just a bit different, and sometimes they're more original. So the video I'm playing over here is a tour through the road that many of us are familiar with. So if you are familiar with Hong Kong surroundings, this is a trip down Hill Road. I bet you may recognize some of the scenes, but others might remain a bit unfamiliar. And given today's topic, it's not hard to imagine that this is an AI-generated film. So this is a mixture of real street views with AI interpolations. What AI tools can do right now is to take a beginner frame and an end frame and create whatever that is in between. These are the other keyframes I inserted to this film clip. And in most cases, it has demonstrated an incredible knowledge of space, as oftentimes the beginning frame and the end frame, they are very dissimilar, but somehow AI can still put a coherent space between them. But nonetheless, there are some weird moments if you look closely. For example, the bridge on the top is turning at an awkward angle, or the building at the bottom, it just looks a little too narrow, looks like it's being cut in half. That is exactly the effect I want to achieve here. It's this distance, this gap between the real and the unreal. It's an unfamiliar experience that makes you question what you see instead of believing in it, right? And this is an ongoing project, and these days we are trying to forge two spaces that don't belong together into a coherent journey. Like over here, it's two separate footbridge walks that are actually apart from each other, but somehow we convinced and forced AI to merge them and creating this coherent space. The next project I'm introducing is also searching for this impression of Hong Kong, of the city we live in, although it is using a different tool. So this is done by image to 3D. We first started again from street views. This time, we tried to select those typical Hong Kong street objects from street views. And we made a bunch of cutouts. All of them are 2D figures. And these 2D figures were then translated into 3D models using AI. And we were very lucky to capture some of the funny imperfections. For example, if you look closely at the woman on the right, she's carrying a red bag in the picture, but somehow that is recognized as a big pendant in front of her. In fact, she doesn't have a right hand in the model. So we were lucky. And although every single model was quite ambiguous, somehow they collectively capture the essence of the city. Each individual model is very funky, like it has a blobby shape. It also has very low resolution texture, but that oddly captures the chaotic but also vibrant nature of Hong Kong street. The work above was done with the help of students and through a collaborative workshop. Then I took this further with my partners to push this into other translations, into other mediums, because we're curious to see how other artificial minds would see the model that we have generated. So what we did here was that we used a different tool to summarize the previous model into 3 keywords, therefore translating the 3D model into text again. And then, following that, using those 3 keywords to generate the next 3D model. Although 2 translations are fairly accurate on their own, the result you get at the end appears a lot more generic and therefore losing the unique quality that make them relevant to Hong Kong. But that's all right, because we thought we're onto something. In this recursive translation, the infidelity of AI translation accumulates, and to a point that it becomes a valuable aesthetic quality. And this is actually what I'm doing using the previous two projects, which is to analyze the tool and aestheticize it, especially when such unique qualities are most visible in the early stages of these tools. So the story after this is that within a few months after the completion of the first demo, both tools I used here have been upgraded and became more powerful. And one day, I do not doubt that AI tools will be able to create more convincing results with almost no effort. But that just leads me to question, does that make it a better tool? Or before that, what does a better tool mean? Is it simply just something faster or more realistic? Or I would question even here, can we even define that direction of advancement? Because I'm arguing using this example in the history. So before the advent of photography, painting techniques were perfecting toward a more realistic representation. That is because one of the functions of painting back then was to document reality. However, this function did not make any more sense because of photography, which can do that faster and better. And this made artists question, what is the quality that make painting different from other mediums, from photography? And this partially gave rise to other approaches to painting, such as the Impressionism. So now think about the AI buzzwords that I mentioned at the beginning, right? They were new paradigms, new era, and now they are put into question because such destination of development, it's itself questionable and obscure. In this obscure timeline, can we examine AI tools nowadays retrospectively as if we're standing 50 years from now? Can we start to imagine another post-condition just like postmodern or post-digital? Another analogy I'm trying to make here is probably using an iPad and a guitar, two everyday projects we see. So an iPad upgrades almost every year, but users will still buy the new version because they're convinced that the new version offers more powerful functions and a smoother experience. That is true, but I would be very skeptical if someone says that they have invented a new guitar. Because unlike the pursuit for higher performance, as in the case of an iPad, it just doesn't make sense to make a louder guitar anymore. The difference I want to point out over here is that an iPad is a product, whereas a guitar is a tool. An iPad is a product whose functions are predefined by the manufacturer, and one must follow the exact instructions to use the iPad in order to do it in a purposeful way. Whereas guitar is a tool that lends itself fully to the user. Although there's a basic way of operating it, it is depending on the user to do those operations in a meaningful way and come up with a melody. And I hope that also summarizes everything I'm doing over here, which is to bring these digital mediums closer to a tool than a product. And the last project I'm showing is dealing with an archaic digital technique compared to AI, which is rendering. And I'm also doing that in a more archaic way, because this is done completely physically. But first, let me introduce some basic knowledge about rendering. So in a typical ray tracing process, the camera will shoot a certain ray through one pixel in the image, and that ray will continue to travel until it hits something, and then the render engine will calculate the brightness and the color of that spot. And that color will be exactly that pixel that the ray just went through. And the way to calculate the brightness is sometimes surprisingly easy. So according to the most basic shading method, it only relates to two things. One is the direction of the light, the other is the direction of the surface. This shading method is so simple that it can be done manually, and that is exactly what I did here. So I stayed in this room for 3 days, turned the light off, and tried to seal every single opening that could let light in. And then I pulled a string from the ceiling, which represents a non-existing light. And then I pulled that string close to every single spot of that classroom and measuring the angle between the string and the surface. And that angle gave me a reference of how much light should be applied to that spot in order to follow the rule of that rendering algorithm. And then that's what I did. I illuminated the space spot by spot. In the end, the space was illuminated by 3,000 individual light spots, and therefore there were more than 3,000 individual pictures taken before they were composited into this final rendering. And that's the final result. What I'm doing here is more than just presenting a final product, but also to prolong a process which is as fast as milliseconds these days as in a digital rendering to something as long as 3 days. And in fact, all three experiments are trying to prolong this instantaneous digital process, whether it is rendering or AI. Because I try to open the black box and try to examine what is going on there in order to reclaim our agencies as designers and as humans in general. And in fact, these rapidly developing techniques are calling for such careful examination for us to both exploit their creative potential, but also just for us to understand them better. Because once we understand them, then we can discuss it and incorporate that into the discourse of art and architecture before all of these qualities get lost in the history. And if you zoom into this final image, you actually see my hands because those were accidentally captured as the imperfections of the process. But this is also the trace of the material and the physical process itself, which is meaningful because that separates this final work from either a seamless digital image or reality. Instead of blurring the two, it tries to expose the distance between them. Thank you.